Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
A couple of years ago, I was driving home from Pryor. I was down helping Jesse and Gus, and just after dark, tired, wanting to get home and get a shower and go to bed. Ever been in that situation? And two deer decided to change my plans. They run across, and one get in front of the truck, and one runs right to the side of the door, looking right at him, and he just runs straight at me and runs right into him. So obviously, how many of you ever had some disruptive moments like that? Ever had it? In fact, we probably have them every day, every week. And I think it's interesting. I think a lot of us have the response that you might have remembered the black lady. It was on. They kept quoting her on the radio a lot a few years back when she had a disruptive moment. I ain't got time for this. You remember seeing that one? Yeah. And how many of us have said the same thing over and over again? I want to think about it. What can we learn about our disruptive moments? In fact, I'm sure Don and Katie saw it today driving up. All of a sudden, 169 going southbound was completely closed. They had everybody diverted off to I-44. They had about one car. Looks like the transmission went out in the middle of the road, and somebody abandoned the car in the center lane. So I had all these policemen out there redirecting the traffic. A little bit of a disruptive moment if you're trying to drive, especially if you're out of state, to kind of figure out exactly where to go. But think about it, we all have those disruptive moments, trials, whatever you would like to call it. First of all, I think it's interesting when you look at it, the certainty of disruptive moments. When Jesus was talking, John 14 well, you don't have to turn to it, I'll give it to you, but and also in John 16, if you remember, he said that he was going to be leaving, but remember he said he gives you peace, but in the end of it he says, in the world you will have tribulation. So I think it's important to recognize the certainty that we're going to have. We will have trials. We will have it. So I think it's important to recognize it. I think you have James 1, consider it all my joy, my brother, when you encounter various trials. He doesn't use the word if. We all are going to get them, just different ranges of them. I think we also can look at what's the causes for disruptions. One of the causes is just the general trials due to fallen man, a fallen condition. If you remember in when Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, remember he says, I'm convinced that neither death nor life, angels, or nothing can separate me. But he also said, shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? There's all those things. What about Ukraine? Do you think any of those people are suffering different things because of fallen man? All kinds of different things are going on there. So we have general trials that we have. COVID did it with us too. A lot of us, a lot of different things happen is because of it. Also, trials are allowed to develop us. Remember in James 1, 2-4, so that if you'll go through it, it says you may become perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. He wants to bring about maturity. And so I think it's interesting. So another one is general trials, one to develop us. The third one, I think, is the chastening. If you remember in Hebrews chapter 12, he disciplines us as he disciplines what? A son or a daughter. So chastening by the Lord. Kind of like the children of Israel, do they get a few spankings along the way? Read the Old Testament, they're getting spanked all the time. And so you and I as well. Also, if you think about it, trials also reveal things about us. In Job chapter 1, you remember when Satan comes before God and God asks him, have you considered my servant Job? And they said, well, if you take away all his possessions and everything, he's going to do what? He'll deny him. So God says you can. He took it away, he didn't deny it. Oh, but if you do something to him physically, you will. That didn't work either. But for a lot of us, it would have. So think a lot of it can reveal. I think stop and you think about it, the children, not children, but the disciples, how many of them said they wouldn't deny Christ? All of them didn't. And how many were still with him? And how many of them left? Now they learned from it, because if you look at what happened to them at the end of their life, they all suffered some tremendous persecution and death along the way. So they revealed things early, they made, obviously trusted it. So we have the certainty and we have the causes, but what's the course for disruptions? How many of you always want to hit your GPS when you have that and reroute you? Okay? Can we get rerouted with that? So I want to think about that. First of all, I think it's interesting in Nahum chapter 1 and verse 7, it says that to take refuge in God your stronghold. When trials come, what's our first tendency for most of us? Is it to turn straight to the Lord and then stay there? Or do we start trying to solve it? I do another job, I can do this. I need a second opinion. I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to call people, do whatever it might be. I think it's interesting too, how many of us go to the stronghold in Philippians 4 and we give them our requests and then we take it back. It reminds me a lot. I think the first one, like I said, take the course, is to take a refuge in Him. It reminds me, since I'm at the refinery, I've got 70, thereabouts, tanks, 60 tanks, whatever. Little black tanks. You walk up to them, and they're on skids. A lot of rabbits live in the little openings where the skids go. And when you walk up, all of a sudden you'll scare them or do whatever. They're perfectly safe. You don't even know they're there. But when you get them up close, what do? Run. Run right out in the open, or any of the coyotes out there, or the bird, or the hawks as well as the eagles are right there ready. How many of us do the same thing? We have a perfectly safe refuge, and what do? We run out. So I think the first course of action is take refuge and then stay there. A good example is that of Elijah. He used to go, remember, in First Kings 18, he's told to go to the brook and stay there. The brook is drying up. The brook dries up. But he doesn't leave until God tells him to leave. That's the hardest part. We, with our senses, look around and we see how bad stuff's getting. We make decisions ahead of time. I think the second thing is, look over in Galatians with me for chapter 6. So we'll probably get this more in the weeks to come. But in Galatians chapter 6, it relates to last week's topic too, but in Galatians chapter 6, we take refuge. Second thing is that of what's the role of others. So you notice in verse 2 and then in verse 5. Galatians 6, verse 2 and verse 5. Let's read verse 5 first. Each one shall bear his own load. So each one of us has a load we need to carry. Sometimes we get upset when everybody's always wanting to unload theirs, not want to carry anything. In verse 2, though, it says, bear one another's burdens, and thus fulfill the law of Christ. When it talks about bearing one another's burdens there, it's a word referring to an excessive burden, one that it's too heavy for them. So we all carry loads, but there comes times when a load is too heavy, and we have to come alongside to help. And so I think it's important. Christ is our refuge, God's our refuge, but two, we need others to help us along the way. And sometimes it can, never forget, in 1974, I was climbing Pikes Peak. There was 4 teenagers, and we had 2 guides climbing Pikes Peak. But you had to go together as a team. One person stopped, the entire team had to stop. Well, we get to right to the summit, where the tram goes up on one side and the road goes up on the other. And one guy decides, I've had enough. I'm not going any further. You're thinking, there it is. We've come this far. We've hiked a 50-pound pack, 25 miles, and now you're going to tell me, forget it? The only way we could get him to go was what? Take his pack. So I got the lion's share of his pack, and then he takes off running, and he gets to the top and says, "Hey, I'm the first one to the top." You won. You felt like skinning him alive. But the only way you're going to get him there, going as a team, is you're going to have to carry his load the last part. And I think it's important for us to do the same thing. So we have, of course, we can do is taking refuge in him. The second one is the role of others. Let's go to 1 Peter. We'll be in 1 Peter and Hebrews for the last two passages. 1 Peter chapter 1. If you remember, they were going through a lot of persecution, had a lot of disruptions. 1 Peter chapter 1. In verse 4 to 6. To obtain, is verse 4, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are protected by the power of God through the faith and salvation ready to be revealed in the last days. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while it is necessary, you've been distressed by various trials. I just want you to recognize two things. The temporary disruptions or trials. He says temporary. Even if it's the rest of your life, when you look at eternity, that's still temporary. I need to recognize what I'm going through is temporary, even if it's for the rest of my life. The second one I want you to notice is the eternal perspective. What do you have waiting for you? Something that's imperishable, waiting for you in heaven. So we need to keep our eyes on the end. So I think it's important while you do anything you're going through these disruptive moments is to keep an eye on the eternity. This is temporary, that's eternal. And keep reading, I think it's interesting. Warren Wiersbe wrote this, tried for a season, pure for eternity. I think that's important. Getting rid of the dross along the way. But I think when you look at it, look in verse 7, because you are recognizing the eternal part, you're recognizing the temporal part, but notice in verse 7, that the proof of your faith being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, to be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Notice, I think, another course is he's refining, he's revealing, and he's rewarding. How do you get rid of the dross? You heat it, and it comes to the surface. How hot does it have to get? Depends upon how much you're trying to get rid of and what you're trying to get rid of. Some of it has to get pretty hot. Working at the refinery, we're doing that all the time. That's how you would come up with all the different products. You have all the towers, you wonder what they are. When it gets to this temperature, yours will be a way for this product to come off. It gets hotter, this product comes off in another sort. They then can also add things to it to come up with a third product. That's what they're doing all the time. So while you have all the different trucks pulling in, you look at all the stuff for, whether it be roofing material, you name it, it all comes from the refinery. You realize your candy that you eat, the chocolate you eat on your candy bar, that has wax on the outside. That came from the refinery. People don't realize just what all. You say get rid of refinery, people don't realize what happened to the way we live, if we did. But it all comes because of heat and cooling. But think about it. Here's one I thought was interesting. This is also a Warren Wiersbe. When God permits His children to go through the furnace, He keeps His eye on the clock and His hand on the temperature, or thermostat rather. Eye on the clock, hand on the thermostat, and with a loving heart, He knows how much and how long. I think that's a good statement to make. But I always think He needs to turn it down a little bit, He needs to turn it off, and He needs to. But again, that's for God to decide. That must make art. So that's the course that we have. But what about the course we take? What about I think another thing is we have to release something. Let's look at it for a moment. Look over at 2 Corinthians then. So we've been in Peter, now look at 2 Corinthians. How many of you find it hard to release? You got your hand on something and you don't want to release it. I think most of us feel that way. We want to be in charge. How many of you like it when other people are in charge? Good way to tell is ride with somebody. How many of them put a foot, there's a hole in the floorboard where they've been hitting the brake? Hand on the steering, hand on the front of the dash, or they're trying to turn the car, you feel if they're in the back seat, you'll feel your seat getting kicked and do all kinds of stuff going on. I think a lot of us do that, but look over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul is in a, if you will, a disruptive moment. He's trial, and he asks God to take it away. Notice why he has it in verse 7. But because of surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason keep me from exalting myself. You think about it, if let's just take for a moment that you or I or Paul, how much of the book-wise of the New Testament did Paul write? Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So you think about the number of books, close to half. Well, how many could that easily get a little bit of pride involved? How many places did he go? How many churches were started because of it? Who was the greatest church planner that we know of? So notice Paul says, to keep me humble, God gave him something to buffet him. Doesn't tell what it is. Some are saying it's his eyesight. There's a lot of different speculation. Scripture doesn't say. Notice what he does then. He asks God to take it away 3 times. And God says no. Obviously, how many of us would have been asking God to take it away? All of us would. God says no, and there's times when you know when it is. How have you ever had it when you're praying and you hear it and God says no, and people are saying you need to pray about it, and you said, well, I have, but God's told me no, and they're going to want to know how. You know when God's talking to you. Notice then what you have, the releasing. When they give it over to him, Paul gave it over to him, and God said no. Notice what he gets. The provision. My grace is sufficient for you. How many of you want God's grace? Now think about that. It's unmerited favor. Notice you not only get unmerited favor, you get grace to help you through it. Notice you also, my grace is sufficient, power is perfected in weakness. You get his power. What causes us to have the greatest witness for the Lord is when we have the power of the Holy Spirit working with us. It's not because of us. So Paul, if you look at some of the others, he wasn't a great speaker. It says he wasn't. But how many people came to know Christ because the Holy Spirit was working through Paul? So we have to release to get his grace, to get his power. And notice the perspective. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. But how much we respond this way? You wanted us taken away, God said no. Most gladly, therefore, I'd rather boast about my weakness and the power of Christ may dwell in me. That's a tremendous statement and difficulty to make. I'll take it. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions and difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Think about it. What about Isaiah 40 and verse 1? Those that wait on the Lord will what? Mount they will mount up the wings of eagles. They'll run and not grow weary, walk and not faint. But how many of us are willing to turn it over to him and do it? So think about it. We have to release. And I think it's interesting. What disruptive trial do I need to release to him today to get his grace and strength? That would be what we all have to ask. Hebrews chapter 12, I've said right in here. So look over in Hebrews chapter 12. We had Lord's Supper, so we'll end a little early today. But Hebrews chapter 12. While you're turning there, some of you just reviewed in. There's a certainty of disruptions. We have causes. There's general ones. There's ones that develop us. There's ones that are chastising us. There's one that reveals us. And the course we take then is we take refuge in the Lord. We also have a role of others to help us. We recognize that they're temporary and that things we get that are eternal when we survive. the things. And we also have a refining. God's refining us, making us more like Him. We have to release it then, just like Christ did. Christ said, take this cup from me, but what? Not my will, but thine be done. He released it. We'll look at our role in verse 7 of chapter 12 of Hebrews. It is for discipline that you endure, for God deals with you as with sons. Okay, when you think about a role that we have, is that we are a child of God. And as a child of God, He's going to bring disruptive things into our life, discipline, whatever it might be, to make us more like Christ. And I think notice it shows that we are His son. But the purpose in Romans 8 verse 29, He's conforming us to the image of His Son. And we are clay, and He's molding us. Now, how would us like to have something chiseled off of it? I'll never forget when my first year of teaching, my principal called me in and talking to me about different stuff. He said, you remind me a lot of myself, that you're a diamond in the rough. In other words, what? You got a lot of edges need to be worked off. You know, how many? Hey, that sounds like a real encouraging statement to make to you. But he was right. But how many of us are still having those things worked off of? I think it's interesting. Notice in verse 6, the last half of 6, He scourges, which is the word for flogging every son whom He receives. Boy, how would we love to just ready to run out and say, Lord, flog me. But He's doing it for what reason? Why do you tell a child no? Why do you discipline a child when they're young? To make the necessary changes so they do not cause so many problems down the road. And the Lord's doing that with us. He's painting. Notice the perspective that you have. So when God's going to punish, let's go up to verse 5. It could be, for you've forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. How many times are we indifferent, despise it, or rail against it? How did Don was talking about Ezekiel with me earlier? That's how they responded. Israel did not really respond to God's discipline like they should have. And how of us when God's doing things, we just ignore it. We don't respond, we don't do it. Notice the second way we can, the next part that you have, nor faint when you are reproved by it. How of us, anytime there's a little bit of discipline, we get discouraged, we get overwhelmed, we quit. Never forget, I had a girl playing basketball for me, just started, had never played before. She was 6 foot, which for that many years ago was the tallest player by far that we had on our team, had potential. She came out, and she was in practice going up against people who played a lot, and had the ball stolen from her, different things happened to her, and she didn't like it, had a shot blocked, she quit. Had tremendous potential and would have done well, but it's going to take a development. When you go against somebody who's never, who has played and you haven't, they can make you look very bad rather easily. You're thinking of what to do and they respond. But what about with God? When He disciplines us, what do we do? How many of us just quit? Notice the third thing that we can do. So you can be indifferent, go against it, you can be discouraged, and you can quit. Notice in verse 7 and then also in verse 11. It's for discipline that you endure. Okay, so we want to endure it. And then notice in verse 11, you have all the discipline for the moment. It seems to be not be joyful, but sorrowful, yet for those who are been trained by it. You endure it, and you are trained by it. And then you have, notice you have the righteousness and holiness of Him. Why do you go, football's getting ready to start for all these high school kids. Why do they go through all these practices this time of year? How many of you want to go running outside in this kind of heat? You're enduring. There's going to be plenty who are going to quit. There'll be plenty who are going to complain. But those that endure it are going to succeed in a lot of things. So you think about it, I'll give you a statement. This is by Charles Spurgeon. I bear witness that I owe more to the fire and the hammer and the file than to anything else in the Lord's workshop. I sometimes question whether I've ever learned anything except through the rod when my schoolroom is darkened by sea moss. He's considered one of the greatest preachers ever lived. I learned more when the Lord's working on it. I'll give you some applications for some principles for disruptive moments. And I think we all get it. It happens to me every time I'm driving between the east and west plant. You ever been on Southwest Boulevard lately? I mean, they're all that's under construction, trying to get ready for the big, centennial thing. And they are constant. It's a 5-lane road, and there's usually sometimes down to just 1 lane. And you don't know which lane you go, and they're stopping you, and you're switching back and forth, and it's a mess. Think about this one. Disruptive moments are often divine appointments. Disruptive moments are often divine appointments. I remember when UPS went on strike back in 1975. Before that, I was working for a roofer. We were in Alabama. I was going to stay, go to summer school. I was in college. We tore off one roof and he decided, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going back wherever he was from. What are you going to do? You committed to renting this house. You're into college, you're going to school, and where's your income coming? Started working for Mrs. Hamler, Mrs. Ketchum, others, doing yard work, what I knew how to do. Get hired at UPS, I was there a few weeks, they're going to strike. So what do? Go back working for Mrs. Ketchum. That's who Ruthie's named after, and really became an incredible friend and really helped. That disruptive moment was a divine appointment. I never would have met her, never would have done anything with her had it not been for that. In the middle of it, of course, you wonder a lot about it. Disruptive moments are not eternal. How many times do they seem like eternal? They last a week, they last whatever. Don, how a disruptive moment with the knee, does that seem like it was eternal? Still does. Okay, I think it's important to recognize it is not eternal. It is not eternal. It could be even eternal on so far as in this life, but it will not go with you. Third one, disruptive moments are often uncomfortable and painful. Are we not said in John 15 that he prunes us? Anytime you prune something, what does the plant or tree do? It bleeds. Same thing happens with you and I. Disruptive moments bring grace and power when we release it to God. If I don't release it to God and try it on my own, what happens? I don't get grace and I don't get power. God resists the proud and gives grace to who? The humble. Disruptive moments often produce dynamic growth. Some of the greatest growing time in your life is through some of the most dark times of your life. Not that you want dark times, but you can have tremendous growth during those times. Because who else can you turn to? Why does he put us in those places? Because so often we don't turn to him until he does. Think about it. What about the early church when you have that dynamic growth? When did the early church really take off and grow? When persecution came. He told them to go into all the world, but they didn't do it. Not until persecution came and they left for the sake and the safety of their family, and they took their Christianity with them and it started spreading. I'll give you another one. Disruptive moments and how we respond to them will reflect in what we receive from him. How you respond will reflect in what you receive from him. Here's one from Charles Spurgeon. Those who navigate little streams and shallow creeks, which I think was what most of us want to be in, know but little of the God of the tempest. But those who do business in the great waters, these see his wonders in the deep. Among the huge Atlantic waves of bereavement, poverty, temptation, and reproach, we learn the power of Jehovah because we feel the littleness of man. There's nothing I can do. I'm in the middle of something. I can't do any of this. God comes through. But you only know that when you're in the deep end. If you're in the shallow end, what do? You stand up and walk out. So think about it. This disruptive moments that you're having, and we all have, are we going to release it to Him? Recognize it? Basically, allow it temporary and recognize He's there to help us if we rely on Him.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.